We've been looking in our recent sermon series at the main thing, or the greatest commandment, as is described in Mark, in Matthew and Luke. And we're getting towards the end of it. But I want to tell you something about something I heard a while ago. I think probably one of the most unhelpful things that I have ever heard another Christian say, I know you probably can't imagine that Christians could ever say anything unhelpful, was this: better to burn out than rust out. Now, I heard this said a number of times by someone through whom the Lord has done some amazing things, and they genuinely believed this, and they lived it out, so at least they're not a hypocrite. But perhaps they didn't always realise the harm that this philosophy of life sometimes caused around themselves and to themselves by living this way. For those of you who understand a little bit about cars, and I understand a tiny amount about cars, I know that if a car is not looked after and serviced regularly and properly, and also gets driven too hard, too fast, too far for too long, it's almost undoubtedly at some point going to overheat and break down. It could even set on fire, which would harm not just the car but everyone in it, right? And probably people around it as well. Now, why on earth would anyone want to do that? Unfortunately, we can sometimes live in ways that actually overlook the need to care for ourselves. In our God-given and righteous desire to love and serve God above all things, and in our passion and zeal to love others, to love our neighbour, we sometimes might overlook the little bit that Jesus kind of assumes when he shares the greatest commandment. The main thing that we've been exploring in the last few weeks, based on Mark 12, is this. One of the teachers of the law came to Jesus and one of the teachers of the law heard them debating, and noticing that Jesus had given a good answer, he asked, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important commandment, said Jesus, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and all of your strength. The second is this: love your neighbour as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And here, as we've talked about, we see kind of a summary of the whole Torah, the teaching of what it means to be God's people, in a kind of, short, pithy mission statement, if you like. Love, worship, and serve only God, and work this out in the way that you treat your neighbour. And yet the thing which we gloss over, or which we maybe assume but don't really reflect on, perhaps, is that he says to love your neighbour as yourself. In other words, Jesus kind of takes it as a given that people already have a healthy regard for themselves. And he teaches people to extend that regard to others. Now, we live in a society, or at least parts of society, don't we, where we're actually constantly bombarded with messages that suggest we should love ourselves, in a certain way at least. Treat yourself because you're worth it. Sorry, Kat, she's not here, is she? My mother-in-law is actually American, but she's amazing. I say but, and she's amazing. Please make her feel welcome. Sorry, Linda. Put yourself first. You deserve it. Now, a huge theme that actually moves through the whole of the scriptures is that this whole world is a gift from the Lord who made all things out of the generosity and the grace of who God is. God is perfect selflessness and love. And in Jesus, God shows us a way to live that's actually liberated from all of the focus that our ego often has on ourselves. Our pride, our insecurity, our desperation for recognition and success, or our fear of failure. And Jesus invites us to a life that is not primarily for ourselves, but which finds peace and joy and eternal purpose in living for him and for him alone. Jesus doesn't say, follow your heart. He says, follow me. And in following him, our hearts will be cleansed, changed, and made whole. And yet, if we aren't careful, we can make the mistake sometimes of overlooking that our lives are renewed to love God and to love our neighbour precisely as we experience and know the love of Christ for ourselves. I long for other people to just know that they're loved by God and to encounter this incredible good news that before anything we do or don't do in this life, God loves us. And he searches for us through danger, through death, through darkness, to reach all people, to stand in our place on our behalf and give himself to save us so that we might all know him and know that we are loved without any cause on our part, but because he is good and he is loving and he can be trusted. And one of the purposes of the church, of Christian community, is that we're to be a community of love where we continually give of ourselves for others as those who experience selfless, sacrificial love as well. This is our witness to the world. As Jesus says in John 13, verse 35, he says, "By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another." Just, it's quite straightforward. And without this mutual and communal giving and receiving of love, church can become a pretty bleak place, to be honest. And Jesus assumes that people have a healthy love, or at least an awareness of themselves and their needs in this commandment. But I think he also probably knows that it's so easy for us to become blind and distracted and lost in our very best attempts to live well. I think that's why Jesus encouraged his disciples at times to rest, why he feasted, had parties, and why he had fun and made jokes. And he encouraged people, as well as challenged and offered difficult teachings too. And in an extraordinary passage in Matthew 11, Jesus is talking, and then he talks to those who are probably maybe at the risk of either burnout or rusting up, who are perhaps feeling a bit useless and maybe unlovable. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." That's Matthew 11, 28 to 30. I was going to read it and go through the slides at the same time, but can't multitask. There's a way that Jesus offers us to live, each single one of us, and whilst it involves challenges and uncertainty and can be costly at times, it is incomparably good. Jesus does not say that he is a harsh taskmaster or an unfair companion. He is gentle and humble in heart, or gentle and lowly, as one translation puts it. There is time and space when we are in Jesus' orbit to look after ourselves, to be looked after, to care for one another, to catch our breath and recover amidst all of the challenges that we face in seeking to love God and our neighbour well. I wonder if you have ever heard anyone preach on loving yourself well. I haven't. And whilst I think we really might risk focusing unhealthily on ourselves, I know I do at times, I think this is worth the risk to talk about this, because we often live and act and talk as Christians actually as though we don't matter at all personally, as though other people are the only ones who matter, as though I don't matter to God, when we do, actually. You matter a heck of a lot to God, as do I. In case you haven't heard me mention him yet, I'm a huge fan of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor and theologian who stood against Hitler and the Nazis during the Third Reich. A very intense time to be a Christian. And he actually talks about this theme in his writings in a letter towards the end of his life. It was during the period where many of his fellow ministers were being evicted from their homes or their churches, having their salaries or their livelihoods taken away, experiencing persecution, being arrested, and even taken to concentration camps or forced conscription in the army. Because they were standing against the exclusion of Jewish believers from the church and claiming that Jesus Christ is Lord over the church and not the state. I think we can at least imagine that it was probably an extremely intense and stressful and overwhelming time for many of these ministers as they were seeking to be faithful, to love God, to love their neighbour. They were hard-pressed, extremely stressed, and some of them were depressed. And amidst his encouragements to keep going and being faithful, to remain disciplined in prayer, to not give up, Bonhoeffer wrote this reflection. He said, "I believe that a great deal of the exhaustion and the sterility in our ranks is rooted in the lack of selfless self-love. Since this topic has no place in the official Protestant ethic, we arrogantly disregard it and become work-obsessed to the detriment of the individual and the whole." Now this sounds a little bit hardcore, what he's saying, doesn't it? But isn't it pretty accurate for much of our lives at times? An attitude of selfless self-love is not a privilege for those people whose lives are fine, but it is a gift of God to those who are at times overwhelmed and hard-pressed. Some of us could really do with taking a holiday. And it would be an act of selfless self-love to ensure that that happens. Some of us could really benefit from having a regular day off each week. And actually, the world won't end if we do that. Some of us could really benefit just from reaching out to some people that we like, whose company we enjoy, and seeing if they'd be up for hanging out sometime. Some of us could benefit from maybe letting go of the things that we can't control, because we're still loved even when things don't turn out the way that we want. And some of us would maybe benefit from finding ways to rest from the multitude of thoughts and expectations and voices and pressures that we have maybe racing inside our heads at times, which can grind us down. That's one of the reasons I go running. It's a chance for my body almost to remind me that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, that I'm loved. And it de-stresses me and draws my attention to the God of creation who loves me and to those around me again. Whether I'm running well or not very well at all, it doesn't really matter. Now, there's always a risk that we may end up loving ourselves in a way that's actually not necessarily very faithful or Christ-like or good. But I think it is important to reflect on this assumption that Jesus has of us, that to be that all God made us to be, to love him with everything, and to love our neighbour, we do that as those who have a compassionate and loving attitude towards ourselves. I think Jesus loves himself perfectly. He's not egotistical. He's not self-absorbed. He's not entitled. He's not unrealistic either. He's gentle and humble in heart, and he knows fully who he is. He is the eternal and beloved Son of God. And all that Jesus is and does witnesses to that. So for us too, God invites us to be reborn anew as children of God who are seen and known and delighted in simply because we are loved by God. It's a gift of grace that we're reminded of again and again, because we can easily forget and so easily believe something different about ourselves in the complexities of this life. Love is a gift that we receive in the gospel, not one that we earn. Next month I'm going to be 40 years old. I know, it's going to be a big one. 13th of December to be precise. That's Saturday, 13th of December. 40 years old, 13th of December. A Saturday. And I'll probably be getting given some gifts. 1 or 2. Not because I deserve them at all, but because a few people in my family will want to give me some presents because they love me. And that's it. How much more is it with God? That he loves us, regardless of how old or young we are. He loves us, regardless of how well or unwell we are, how useful or useless we might feel about ourselves, how good-looking, talented, funny, helpful we are or are not. We're just loved. And we can treat ourselves in light of this with kindness and compassion and patience. The same kindness and compassion and patience that we seek to treat others. When we start thinking about whether we deserve or don't deserve love, we totally miss out on the truth of love, the one who revealed his love to us fully in Jesus. So whether you feel lovable or unlovable today, I hope you might at least believe you are loved. Every single one of us here is infinitely precious to Jesus, who invites us to rest in his love, to remember who we are, and to simply just embrace the gift of his love, which is based on him as the giver and not on us. Therefore, we can love ourselves in a well sort of way, because God does. And it's from the realization of his love for us that we can grow in love for him and for others and for this whole world. but just a word to help us and guide us in this pursuit of a selfless self-love that's offered. The love that Jesus assumes we have for ourselves. This is a love that is inseparably related to him and to others. Love is never isolated, but always within relationship. Caring for ourselves, considering our own needs, recognizing that we matter as well, that we are precious. This has got to be discerned with the recognition that any love for myself is only good and right and true if it enriches my love for God and for other people as well. I remember the early days of being a dad, which were nuts. Sorry, Stephen and Samantha. Prayers for you guys. It's an amazing adventure, but it can be a bit hard at times, can't it? Tiredless, like I had never, ever known before. And all sorts of weird new things to work out. But I was determined to be disciplined with my daily prayer time so that I could put God first and so that I could remain rooted in God's love, which would enable me to love my family well. At least that's how I saw it. And I remember a few occasions, quite a few occasions, where maybe Becca would come in absolutely exhausted, understandably. Or like one of the boys might crawl in or toddle in with a smile on their face wanting to see Daddy. And something inside me would just get irrationally angry. Don't you know I'm praying? I think my thought process was this, that I was trying really hard to spend time with God, do that because I know it's really important for me. That's the most important thing that I'm going to do if I'm going to love my family well. And I would insist that I also needed space for exercise, for sleeping well, and time to process all my feelings with Becca at the end of the day. And also to have evenings with my friends where the kids wouldn't disturb me so that I could do all the things that were really good for me in order to be a really good husband and father to Becca and the boys. But in reality, I wasn't really being very considerate of Becca and the kids at all, though I thought I was. Now it's complicated, and we're all very different people, aren't we? So please don't compare my experience to yours. But I share this as an example of how self-love sometimes isn't actually very selfless, because it can impinge on others and even harm others. And we can deceive ourselves into thinking that we're being faithful when actually we're just being selfish. Some of us here are probably very, very used to focusing on ourselves and our own needs. So today might not be particularly necessary for you, if that's the case. But I imagine there are people here today, like there are so many people around in the world today, who live and act and maybe even believe as though they are not worth anything. Who live as though no one cares for them, and so therefore don't care for themselves. And who've maybe spent so long only putting others first that they don't realize that God truly loves them as well and offers them freedom and fullness of life too. We're all at different stages of our lives as disciples of Jesus. Some of us are doing all right, praise God. And some of us are stretched, strained and stressed, confused maybe which way to go. And Jesus is alongside us today, reminding us that we are loved. And he invites us to take some time with him, if we can allow ourselves, to disentangle ourselves at points from heavy burdens and unrealistic expectations, to recover our lives so that we can love God and our neighbour more faithfully, actually, more wholly, and more truthfully. And I think we can work together at this. That's one of the gifts, as I said, of being a Christian community, is that we try to support one another. When any of us feel a bit overwhelmed, we can offer the gift of love anew, and we can receive the gift of love anew. A love which is freeing and renewing in terms of our relationships, because it enables us to live selflessly again. And that's one of the key reasons why we gather on a Sunday, to be reoriented again to the one whose perfect love cleanses us and renews us to live ultimately for him and for this world that he has reclaimed as his own.